Well, Lauren and Dan, today's Senate hearing is going to be a video conference. Dr. Anthony Fauci and others speaking before the Senate Committee on Health will be doing so remotely since they are all self-quarantined. Due to COVID-19 cases on Capitol Hill, the heads of the FDA and CDC, Drs. Robert Redfield and Stephen Hahn, will be addressing senators from their home. Fellow task force member Dr. Fauci is also self-quarantined. He's expected to issue a dire warning about needless suffering and death due to states reopening too soon. But Republican senators are said to argue that getting Americans back to work and school can be done safely and quickly. Democrats are demanding a national strategy for reliable testing by May 24th. One medical expert agrees that testing is key.
We're just getting started in the second inning of this 9-inning game. So you can understand why we have to have a comprehensive plan for things like testing and so forth that are so different than what we have right now. We're just getting started.
The Trump administration has earmarked $11 billion for states to conduct widespread testing, but there are no details on a national testing plan. Senate Committee Chairman Senator Lamar Alexander will lead today's hearing remotely from Tennessee due to exposure to a positive case on his staff. Now, the easing of restrictions has prompted some updated numbers out of the University of Washington, which now predicts more than 137,000 coronavirus deaths in the U.S. by early August. Reporting live, I'm Nancy Liu, WGN News.
Detect and isolate cases, to map their exposure, and to prevent substantial spikes moving forward. Most importantly, our healthcare system, thanks in part to flexibilities from this administration, has the beds and the equipment necessary to address the most serious cases when they arise. Now, with these tools in hand, we have begun to reopen. To be clear, we continue to scale up testing and to take measure to protect the most vulnerable. And the data points are increasingly clear. For older Americans and for those with chronic conditions like diabetes and high blood pressure, this virus remains a threat, a dangerous threat. A recent report suggested that in New York, roughly 90% of the fatalities had underlying issues. 2/3 of fatalities were 70 years or older, 95% over the age of 50. In South Carolina, the median age of patients who've died from the virus, 76.5. Nearly 2/3 of fatalities have been patients older than 71, and nearly 90% were over the age of 60, and roughly 98% in South Carolina are over the age of 50. Contrast that with those aged 20 and younger, where we've seen no deaths. Fewer than 1% of deaths in my state have been under the age of 40. Every single death is a tragedy. Every single one. And we mourn with our family members who've lost their loved ones. We are taking every measure to protect our older South Carolinians as well as those with underlying conditions. But when we set out to flatten the curve by taking aggressive, unprecedented measures like staying at home orders and mass small business closures, we didn't set out with the goal of preventing 100% fatalities. That would be unrealistic. It is impossible. And we didn't set out to keep quarantines in place until we found a safe and effective vaccine. That would take too long. Dr. Redfield, your agency put out a helpful graphic showing two curves. One, which spiked quickly and peaked high, reflected daily cases without protective measures. The other, flatter curve, showed cases with those measures in place. And the whole point, which the graphic illustrated, was to make sure that we did not exceed hospital capacity. So, while I respect the need for caution, we are too often presented with a false dichotomy, either saving our economy or saving lives. We've seen the goalpost around flattening the curve move, and I think that's unfortunate, because at the same time we're doing that, businesses have collapsed, mental and physical health have declined. depths of despair escalate, educational outcomes nosedive, as we wait in our living rooms praying for some good news around therapies and around vaccines. We set out to flatten the curve, and I think we've done a pretty good job of that. We need to do better, and we will do better. My question, Dr. Fauci, is as we start the process of moving towards reopening South Carolina, what else would you suggest that we could do to protect our most vulnerable populations?
Thank you, Senator Scott. You gave a really very eloquent description of what I think would be a model way, the way you've approached this. I mean, you have put things in place that I think would optimize your capability of reopening. And as I was thinking as you were speaking, I'd almost want to clone that and make sure other people hear about that and see what you've been doing. The issue of your direct question to me about the vulnerable populations is that, as we have said in our guidelines, and it looks like you are ready to progress carefully because you put into place a very good system, that the vulnerables, the elderly and those with underlying conditions, should be those who at the very last lifting of mitigations should be those who are left in a situation where they might be in danger of getting infected. In other words, protect them right up until the very end of the relaxation of your mitigation. Because as you said very correctly, those are the individuals that are the most vulnerable to the morbidity and the mortality. So those are individuals, particularly I might say, sir, those in the minority group, the African American and Hispanics, who for a variety of situations that are the social determinants of health have a greater likelihood of not only getting infected, but of also having the underlying conditions that would make their risk for a high degree of morbidity and mortality higher. So it looks like you're doing things very, very well, and I would encourage you to continue and to follow the guidelines as you get closer to normalizing your state. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fauci, and I'll just simply close with this since I'm out of time. Thank you for the many conversations that you and I have had about those vulnerable populations, to include minorities as well as our senior citizens. I will say that without any question, when you look at nursing homes, as typically African Americans and Hispanics are the certified nursing assistants who are providing care for the elderly population. So your focus on those two very vulnerable groups is much appreciated, and thank you for your expertise.
Thank you, Senator Scott. And Senator Smith.
Thank you so much, Chair Alexander and Ranking Member Murray. And thanks to all of you for being here today and for your service. Dr. Fauci, I have to say you are in the unenviable position of being the person that so many Americans and Minnesotans trust to give us the straight scoop and tell us what's really happening. You're about the facts and not about the politics, and that's a really good thing. So I have to start by asking a question that I think a lot of Americans want to know, which is, how are you doing? How are you holding up? It's been an unbelievable effort.
I'm doing fine, Senator. Thank you very much for asking. This is such an important problem. It transcends all of us individually and has to be working as a team. And I enjoy very much working with your senators and the governors, because it's at the local level that we're going to make this thing work. So I'm fine. I appreciate your concern.
Well, a lot of people are thinking about you and are grateful for your service, as we are for all of you. So we're gathered today to think about what we need to do to reopen our economy. And I think first about what's happening in my home state of Minnesota, where agriculture is such an important part of how our state works. It's a part of our history and our culture. Pork processors right now are looking at the reality of euthanizing thousands of hogs a day because there is no place to process them because of what's happening in the processing plants. And the working people who do the hard work in those processing plants are getting sick. So here's one story. This is one worker, the Star Tribune wrote about this, named Homare de Jesus. She's an asylum seeker and a mom who works for a contractor that does the cleaning in the processing plants. And she works for $14 an hour, 7 hours a day, 5 days a week. And her job is to sanitize the machines that process the meat into ground meat. And she started feeling sick on April 11th, but she kept going to work. And on April 21st, when one of her coworkers fainted, she told her supervisor that she felt sick, and so she was told to go home, but that if she didn't show any signs of illness, she should come back. She went to the doctor and she paid $115 to get a test and found out a few days later that she was COVID positive. And she's still at home. She's not getting paid, and she doesn't have health insurance. And nearly 2 weeks ago, President Trump deployed the Defense Production Act to keep these processing plants open. But the USDA gave really limited guidance about what would be safe for those workers. It said, for example, in response to testing, which has been such a big part of what we've been talking about today, they said, this is a quote, "Facilities should consider the appropriate role of testing in workplace contact tracing of COVID-19 positive workers in a worksite and assessment." So Dr. Fauci, as we think about how we move forward, we all want to open up the economy. What guidance would you give us in a situation like this here in Minnesota?
Well, I can give you my common sense guidance, although this is not the area of my expertise. It's more in others, but it would seem that if you want to keep things like packing plants open, that you really got to provide the optimum degree of protection for the workers involved, the ability to allow them to go to work safely, and if and when individuals get infected, to immediately be able to get them out and give them the proper care. So I would think when you're calling upon people to perform essential services, you really have almost a moral responsibility to make sure they're well taken care of and well protected. And again, that's not an official proclamation. That's just me speaking as a physician and as a human being.
Well, thank you, Dr. Fauci. And I think that you speak as a human being, but you also speak as the chief epidemiologist of our country and the person that we all trust. And this is the point that I want to make and drive home with everybody, which is this is the kind of guidance that we should be getting and following. And then these are the tools that we have got to have in our country if we are going to reopen our economy as we all want to do. And we move forward with reopening our economy, and yet we still have circumstances like we have in these processing plants and in other places around the state. We are going to be we're going to be right back where we started, and except even in a worse place, as I think you pointed out, Dr. Fauci.
But thank you, Senator. And again, it really does relate to one of the questions that one of your colleague senators asked me before, that one of the things that I keep emphasizing, and I'll just repeat it again because it's important, that when you are in the process of opening up and pulling back on mitigation, you really must have in place the capability of responding when you do have the inevitable upticks in cases. That will absolutely occur. It's how we deal with it and how successful we are in putting the clamps on it that will prevent us from getting the kind of rebound that not only from the standpoint of illness and death would be something that's unacceptable, but it will set us back in our progress towards reopening the country.
Thank you very much, Senator Smith. Senator Romney.
This hearing and the participants in it. Admiral Gioir, I'm going to take off where Senator Hahn spoke. I understand that politicians are going to frame data in a way that's most positive politically. Of course, I don't expect that from admirals. But yesterday, you celebrated that we had done more tests and more tests per capita even than South Korea. But you ignored the fact that they accomplished theirs at the beginning of the outbreak, while we treaded water during February and March. And as a result, by March 6th, the U.S. had completed just 2,000 tests, whereas South Korea had conducted more than 140,000 tests. So partially as a result of that, they have 256 deaths and we have almost 80,000 deaths. I find our testing record nothing to celebrate whatsoever. The fact is their test numbers are going down, 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 down now because they don't have the kind of outbreak we have. Ours are going up, up, up as they have to. I think that's an important lesson for us as we think about the future. On a separate topic, my impression is that with regards to vaccines, where I'm critical of what we've done on testing on vaccines, we've done a pretty darn good job of moving ahead pretty aggressively. And yet the president said the other day that President Obama is responsible for our lack of a vaccine. Dr. Fauci, is President Obama or by extension President Trump, did they do something that made the likelihood of creating a vaccine less likely? Are either President Trump or President Obama responsible for the fact that we don't have a vaccine now, or in delaying it in some way?
No, Senator, not at all. Certainly, President Obama nor President Trump are responsible for our not having a vaccine. We moved, as you said, because I described it in my opening statement, rather rapidly. No one has ever gone from knowing what the virus was to a phase 1 trial as fast as we've done. So I don't think that's something that one should say anybody's responsible for doing anything wrong on that. I think that's right. That's the correct way to do it.
Thank you. That was my impression. I was surprised by the comment, but that was my impression. Dr. Redfield, Senator Sinema and I wrote a letter to you expressing our dismay at the lack of real-time data at the CDC. I'm talking about granular, demographic, hospitalization, treatment data. How is it possible in this day and age that the CDC has never established such a real-time system with accurate data? And what can Congress do to rectify that so we never have to look at something like this again?
There you go. I'm sorry. Senator, thanks for the question. I think you've hit one of the how important they are. The first one I focus on is data modernization, data analytics, and predictive data analysis. Clearly, Congress has come forward in providing funding for data modernization, and we're in the process of implementing that. But the reality is there's an archaic system, a non-integrated public health system. Each public health department has their own systems. This nation needs a modern, highly capable data analytics system that can do predictive analysis. I think it's one of the many shortcomings that have been identified as we went through this outbreak, and I couldn't agree with you more. It's time to get that corrected.
Thank you. Please help guide us as to what we need to do to make sure that happens. And I presume it's not build it ourselves, but work with companies that have that capacity and use that capacity in our favor. Dr. Fauci, one last thing which relates to a virus, and I know I'm asking you the impossible question, but we're all hoping for a vaccine, obviously. It's the objective of our administration to get it as soon as they can, and from what I can tell, they're pulling out all the stops to do exactly that. Given our history with vaccine creation for other coronaviruses, how likely is it? I mean, is it extremely likely we're going to get a vaccine within a year or two? Is it just more likely than not, or is it kind of a long shot?
It's definitely not a long shot, Senator Romney. I would think that it is more likely than not that we will, because this is a virus that induces an immune response that people recover. The overwhelming majority of people recover from this virus. Although there is good morbidity and mortality at a level in certain populations, the very fact that the body is capable of spontaneously clearing the virus tells me that, at least from a conceptual standpoint, we can stimulate the body with a vaccine that would induce a similar response. So although there's no guarantee, I think it clearly much more likely than not that somewhere within that time frame, we will get a vaccine for this virus.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield.
Thank you, Senator Romney. I want to thank the witnesses for their patience. We have 4 more senators, and we'd like to give them a chance to ask their questions. So, Senator Jones.
Thank you very, very much, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to all our witnesses for your being here virtually and also for your incredible service during this time. I want to follow up real quick with an additional statistic that Senator Romney talked about with regard to South Korea, and that is the fact that we are a nation that has about 6 times the population of South Korea, but yet we have about 310 times the number of deaths from this pandemic. So I think we have to be very careful in making comparisons around the world, comparing the United States to other countries. Dr. Redfield, I want to follow up just a little bit with what Senator Murkowski And I think Senator Kane talked a little bit about contact tracing and where we're going. I understand that you are working with states to try to develop plans for reopening. The testing is important, the contact tracing is important, but using that data as well is also going to be important in terms of the quarantine plans that Senator Murphy talked about, child care facilities to allow people to put their kids in a facility while they are still go back to work. All of those issues, including maybe even facilities like vacant hotels or motels that may be used for self-isolation. How is this plan being developed within the CDC? Are those plans going to be individualized by state? Will we, as a member of Congress, have access to those plans? And how are states going to pay for these? And I say that because my state's already using the money that we've already given them as a wish list. I mean, they're talking about building a $200 million state house as opposed to developing the test and doing the contact tracing. So I'd like for you just to drill down a little bit on how these plans are going to develop, what access we will have to have those plans and be able to see them.
Thank you very much, Senator. This is obviously, as I said before, this is a critical component of us taking this time that we have now to get prepared for next fall and winter and building that comprehensive contact tracing capacity. We're working individually with the leadership of the state health departments, the local health departments, territorial and tribal, to try to let them get us to understand what they think their capacity needs are. And those discussions have already happened. As Admiral Gioir said, there's been a variety of federal agencies together on testing and contact tracing. CDC's in position that we've reprogrammed our individuals that we have across the country, over 500, begin to help each of these states. We've augmented that with some additional personnel that we're bringing on board state by state through our foundation. We've moved about $106 billion of the money that Congress has appropriated into the states so they can begin to start thinking about how do they want to hire for a longer-term contact tracing capability. And then, of course, it was mentioned that we're other government programs like AmeriCorps, Peace Corps, so that each group is going to construct their contact tracing piece to what they think their needs are. And I do think it is going to be similar to what we heard from the senator from South Carolina. These are significant increases. He said he increased 20-fold, and they're going to increase again. But the point you brought up is also critically important, and we found that as we already struggled through the repatriation of different Americans from around the country, where we had to put many of these in quarantine, as you know, ended up using military bases, because many of the state and local health departments really haven't developed that system. Where do they put somebody who to be in isolation who's homeless? How do you develop those systems? So this has to be part of it too. Is it there's certain capacity that's intrinsic, or is it certain hotels, as you mentioned? I think the point that was made by one of the other senators is so important about individuals that, particularly, say, the meatpacking individual that has to go home and self-isolate, but maybe they don't have ability to go home and self-isolate because they live in a multi-generation house with about 12 other people. There has to be mechanisms to be brought in to actually have an effective way to identify cases, identify contacts, and then do the appropriate public health measure. And it does have to be comprehensive. It's going to be developed one jurisdiction at a time. I see no reason why these are not transparent documents as they get completed. And it really is a tribute to what the congressional support that you have given so far. As I said, $1.6 billion got into the state for them to begin to do this, in addition to the resources that we've gotten. But it is fundamental. People underestimate how important it is that we have a highly functional, comprehensive, aggressive contact tracing program so that in the next phase of this outbreak, we start containment. We don't have to switch for mitigation.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Redfield. I appreciate it. It sounds to me like we've still got a lot of work to do. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Jones. Senator Braun.
Thank you, Chairman. Been so much discussion about testing in general, Listened to Senator Romney earlier. I think Senator Kane mentioned it. Everybody has. Dr. Hahn, if you remember when we first met, I said, is the FDA going to be more entrepreneurial? Is the FDA going to kind of not be as stodgy? Talking then about how we fix the healthcare system in general. Now this has brought it into clear focus. I've got a timeline that I'm going to submit for the record that shows from January 24th through March 5th, and I want to emphasize what Senator Burr asked earlier. Has the administration ever put an impediment in front of trying to get to testing? And Dr. Hahn, this will end up in a question in a moment, but there was a span of time from January 24th through March 5th that I hope the American public looks at. And it gets back to what's wrong with our healthcare system in general. Early testing, from what I'm seeing, was created by the fact that the CDC said it was going to do its own test. The South Korean test that gets cited so often was not going to be looked at. We had to do our own. I know the FDA worked with the CDC, but the long and short of all of this is that for nearly a month, this was in that bureaucratic swirl. The FDA prevented private and academic development of tests for weeks. The CDC denied access to functioning tests, as I cited, in South Korea. This created, through all the red tape and bureaucracy, to where we had to come up with a one-size-fits-all approach due to the uncertainty of the virus, and we are stuck with that now. I don't want to dwell on that necessarily because I think those were mistakes that we made. I'm tired of having it heard that it's the administration's fault. Dr. Hahn, I'd like to ask you this question. In that spirit of what we talked about during your nomination process, here going forward, will we shed some of that stodginess? Will we look to get therapeutics and vaccines through the system in a quicker method? Because I fear if we don't, and if we treat through bureaucracy how we did the early period of testing, we can belabor this into the distant future. And at that point, there's going to be not only the carnage from the disease itself, but from the economy to deal with. So I'd like your comment on that 1 month stretch, what accountability the FDA and the CDC have, and then whether it looks better in terms of moving more quickly into the future.
Thank you, Senator Braun, for the question. Our timeline of that period demonstrates that we began working with test developers beyond CDC on January 24th and had double-digit number of test developers working with us. One of the issues that we identified was, in fact, availability of the virus and other supplies to actually get that test development done in a timely fashion. Senator, I completely agree with you that this is an opportunity for us to take a look and determine how we can do things better. And I think that's a really important thing for all of us to do. And certainly the FDA, I can promise you, will do that. Looking forward, sir, I can commit to you that we will look at every one of our regulatory authorities. We have done so during this outbreak. We have provided significant flexibility and have tried to provide the right balance between regulatory flexibility and enabling of the great test developers and therapeutic developers in this country, with the need to ensure that our gold standard of safety and efficacy is in place. We have leaned in with manufacturers. We've learned a lot from them, as well as the other stakeholders, and we will continue to learn, and we will, I commit to you, sir, implement the changes that are necessary to make sure that we can act in a more nimble way, but still protect the safety and efficacy of medical products.
Thank you. Dr. Fauci, taking a page from your anti-AIDS playbook that implemented a formal, clearly defined treatment review pathway, can we do that for COVID-19 in a similar parallel track that you put into place back then in the 90s? In fact, I've got a bill called the Promising Pathways Act that is based upon that protocol you put into place. Can we do that to more quickly get through to therapeutics and vaccines here with COVID-19?
Well, it's a different story, but some similarities. If you're referring to the parallel track that I put into place back in the late 80s, which was when there was no availability of drugs at all for HIV, and when we were testing drugs within a protocol, that we would make it available outside of the protocol in what has ultimately turned out to be compassionate use. So what we did is we didn't want to interfere with the integrity of the protocol to determine in a controlled way what was safe and what was effective, but there was a dire need for some sort of accessibility to those drugs outside of a clinical trial for those who might even have some chance of having it. And in fact, that was really, in many respects, the birth of the really firm concept of compassionate use. And in fact, there is a version of that, which I'll hand over to Commissioner Hahn, that is, when you have expanded access and emergency use authorizations for drugs that have not yet been fully proven in a clinical trial. So there is somewhat of an analogy and similarity between what I did in the 1980s and what is actually being done by the FDA now. So Steve, if you might want to comment on that.
I think that's right, Dr. Fauci. The emergency use authorization process by statute allows us to have flexibility and assess the risk-benefit ratio in a public health emergency. And we've done that on the therapeutic side in 3 separate occasions and continue to look at those requests as they come in.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Braun. Senator Rosen.
Here I am. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for bringing this hearing. And I want to thank the dedicated doctors today for their lifetime of work and study and passion. We are a grateful nation for all of your lifelong commitment in fighting disease, not just in the United States, but around the world. And, as I talk to Nevadans about safely reopening the economy, one question that frequently comes up is when are we going to have a vaccine, like everyone's talked about? In Nevada, travel and tourism, of course, the lifeblood for us, and the jobs associated with those industries can only fully come back if we know it's safe to travel and visit or work at our hotels, casinos, restaurants, and attractions. Ultimately, to make this happen, we have to build confidence in our visitors that it's safe. We need a vaccine, and that research is extremely important. However, understanding that this takes time to develop, ensure both safety and efficacy, I'd like to hear more about what research is happening regarding preventative medication research that could be helpful in the time frame before a vaccine, and especially before one is widely available. So I'd like to ask if this could be part of the path to helping us begin to reopen our economy safely and bring visitors not only back to Nevada, but across our country. So Dr. Fauci, what research is currently happening to identify potential monoclonal antibody preventative treatments or other therapeutics? If the right antibody is identified or can be identified, could this be used as a preventative medication to block COVID-19 virus from latching onto those host cells, much like the treatments for rheumatoid arthritis, severe asthma, or other diseases? And secondly, would preventative medication options like this help complement the effectiveness of a vaccine once it's available?
Yeah, so thank you for that question, Senator Rosen. That's an excellent question. And in all of the therapeutic interventions that we are developing, and you mentioned several of them, they could be direct antivirals along the line of remdesivir, but that's just one of a number of possibilities since there are several viral targets in the replication cycle. Using convalescent plasma in a preventive modality, as well as monoclonal antibodies in a preventive modality, are in fact all feasible and will be pursued in parallel with the development of a vaccine. The model of using drugs and other interventions that are effective for treatment is really a great success story in the issue with HIV/AIDS, because many of the interventions that were developed for the full treatment of an infected person are exquisitely effective in preventing infection of HIV. So that's the kind of model that we work out in parallel with treatment for disease. It's the using as treatment as prevention. I believe that will be a part of our effort at the same time as we're putting a full court press on trying to get a vaccine. So it's an excellent question, very relevant.
I know I have a short time left, so I'm just going to kind of abbreviate this. The second most important question that I get, not just from our first responders and people worried about work, but generally, what does the next generation of PPE need to look like for all of us as we go about our lives, not just as workers? Depending on your work, you may need something stronger, more specific, but as all of us, as we want to go out and shop or out to eat or whatever those things are, get on an airplane, should masks be made of a certain material? Gloves, are handkerchiefs effective? Can you talk about PPE for the general public?
Well, you know, the best PPE for the general public, if possible, right now, is to maintain the physical and social distancing. But as we've said, and I think all of us would agree, there are certain circumstances in which it is beyond your control when you need to do necessary things, like go to the drugstore and get your medication, go to the grocery store and get your food, that in fact you need some supplementation to just physical distancing. And that's the reason why some time ago, the recommendation was made, I believe it was Dr. Redfield at the CDC who first said that, about getting some sort of a covering. We don't want to call it a mask because back then we were concerned we would be taking masks away from the healthcare providers, but some sort of mask-like facial covering, I think for the time being, should be a very regular part of how we prevent the spread of infection. And in fact, the more and more as you go outside, right here and where I'm sitting in Washington, D.C., you can see many people out there with masks on, which gives me some degree of comfort that people are taking this very seriously.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Rosen. Senator Loeffler.
Thank you all for being here and for your service. Admiral Gioir, before I start my questions, I want to recognize your new role as the U.S. representative to the World Health Organization. Mitigating a resurgence of this pandemic will take global cooperation. In order to do that, we need accountability and transparency at the WHO. This organization was established to ensure the timely flow of accurate, unbiased information on global health emergencies just as this. Reforms must be made in order to restore the trust that we need here. I hope you'll work with our allies to push for these reforms. This question, I have two questions. The first one is for Dr. Redfield. And Dr. Redfield, Georgians are wondering how we got here today. 1,400 deaths, a third of Georgia's workforce out of work. I'm incredibly concerned about the cover-up and the misinformation coming from China and their efforts to suppress life-saving information at the outset of this outbreak. As we continue to reopen our economy safely, we have to take steps to ensure that another outbreak cannot take hold of the world in this way. I understand CDC has worked with the Chinese CDC on global health security for decades. Can you comment on the level and the timing of the information that you received and relied upon from your Chinese counterparts as this virus emerged?
Well, thank you very much, Senator, and I want to echo how important global health security is as a national security priority for this nation, and we're going to need to be able to respond to that as long as we are a nation. CDC has had relationships with many countries around the world. We have offices in over 45 countries right now, people in over 60. And one of those happens to be China, where we have a U.S. CDC that's with the Chinese CDC. We've worked together for decades, particularly on influenza and emergent infectious diseases. And that has been a very productive, collaborative, scientific interaction. When this original outbreak of pneumonia of unknown etiology came from the original seafood market, there were obviously discussions with the U.S. personnel that were engaging with the Chinese CDC. I personally had discussions as early I think CDC did as early as January, and myself January 3rd, with my counterpart to discuss this. So at a scientific level, we had very good interactions. I think, you know, that's different than the broader Chinese government level.
Thank you, Dr. Redfield. I have a final question for each of our great witnesses today, and it's one that my constituents often ask me. The mainstream media, and indeed some of my colleagues in the Senate, seem to want to paint each of your relationships with our president during this wartime effort as confrontational and lacking consensus. Can you categorically say here to the American people today whether this is true or untrue? From your testimony today, I've seen a very coordinated effort to address this with the administration to combat this pandemic. Can you give me a sense of whether this what the characterization is, whether it's true or untrue? Thank you. I'd ask Dr. Fauci to answer that first.
Yes, no, there is certainly not a confrontational relationship between me and the president. As I've mentioned many times, I give advice, opinion based on evidence-based scientific information. He hears that, he respects it, he gets opinions from a variety of other people, but in no way, in my experience over the last several months, has there been any confrontational relationship between us.
Thank you, Dr. Redfield. Dr. Hahn.
Again, I would echo what Dr. Fauci said. We're there to give our best public health advice, and that's what we do. It's grounded in data and science. I've always felt free to give the best public health advice that I think needs to be given at the time, and it's always been done in a very professional way.
Senator Loeffler, this is Steve Hahn. I do not have a confrontational relationship, have not had a confrontational relationship with the president. He asks questions. I have given him my honest answers rooted in data and science, and he has listened respectfully to those, incorporating that into his decision-making.
And Brett Gioir, I have nothing else but to echo my colleagues. We work very closely together, all the scientists, all the physicians, of course, Ambassador Birx, other scientists within our group. We have a very productive working relationship with each other and also with the president and vice president. It would not be confrontational, and I certainly feel that we have the ability to honestly state our opinions and recommendations, and that's been that way since the beginning.
Thank you, Senator Loeffler. Senator Murray, do you have closing comments?
I do, and if it's all right, I have two quick questions.
Sure.
Well, thank you. You know, Dr. Fauci, while President Trump claimed otherwise, there is no question that an essential part of reopening our economy safely is successfully developing and distributing a vaccine for COVID-19. We need to plan now to deploy a vaccine once it's proven safe and effective. But it is absolutely crucial, this planning process from the clinical trial to distribution and administration recognizes and addresses racial and ethnic disparities in our healthcare system that, as we all know, for too long have been overlooked and unacknowledged in this country. And we have to ensure equitable access to this vaccine for everyone. Dr. Fauci, let me start with you. What steps is NIH taking to make sure that clinical trials for COVID-19 vaccines and therapeutics account for racial and ethnic disparities?
Yeah, thank you very much. That's a very relevant question, Senator Murray. And in fact, in the design of our clinical trials and the sites that we've chosen in our clinical trial network, it's going to be very representative of being able to get minority populations and populations at most risk to be part of the trial so that we know during the trial what the relative efficacy as well as potential for adverse events. It's something we started back in the days of HIV when we tried to get good demographic representation, and we're going to do that with these trials. Thank you.
Thank you. And Dr. Hahn, tell me what steps FDA is taking now to make sure the United States is prepared to produce a sufficient number of vaccines, including the necessary manufacturing, supply chain capacity for supplies like vials and stoppers and syringes.
Thank you, Senator. This is an effort that started as a partnership with the vaccine developers and the NIH and their efforts. So one of the most important things, ma'am, has been the data transparency, sharing of data, both with the agency, NIH, and with the manufacturers, so we can understand what the capacities are, what the needs are from the supply chain, and then how to actually share that so that if one manufacturer's vaccine doesn't go forward, we can use the capacity of that manufacturer for another manufacturer's vaccine. I'm very happy to report that the work of Dr. Marks and Dr. Fauci's group has led to that sort of effort. We've developed, as I mentioned before, this Gantt chart that describes all the steps that go forward with vaccination, including those supplies you described. It is somewhat complicated, ma'am, in that we may very well have hopefully 5 to 7 different candidate vaccines that may need different supplies associated with them, but we've been upfront identifying those supplies, where they're available, and then working with the manufacturers to make sure that they are available.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. And Mr. Chairman, thank you. And thank you to all of our witnesses for joining us today. It is really clear to me that we have more work to do before we can safely get back to work and school and some semblance of normal life in our country. We still need testing to be fast, free, and everywhere, and we need the White House to lay out a detailed national plan to make that happen. We still need adequate personal protective equipment, both for our healthcare workers and for workers at our businesses and at schools when the time comes. We still need guidance from our experts so our communities have the information that they need to reopen schools and businesses safely, confidently, and competently. And so public health workers and healthcare providers have the information they need to keep their patients and communities safe. And while experts have been clear that the day we can safely reopen may be a ways off, there's plenty for us to do in the meantime, both to plan ahead, for example, to make sure that once we have a safe and effective vaccine, we can produce and distribute it to everyone quickly, equitably, and at no cost, and to address the immediate challenges. For example, making sure there are appropriate mental health resources for everyone who's coping with the challenges that are presented by this virus, from the stress of physical isolation, loss of income, to the trauma and anxiety of patients and workers who've been on the front lines. So I'm going to keep pressing Congress and the White House to provide the action and leadership that our communities need. And I hope, Mr. Chairman, that we'll continue to have the opportunities like this to hear directly from the experts and ask pressing questions about how to get our country through this crisis. It's clear we've got a lot further to go, a lot more to do. And so I hope that as our efforts continue, we'll be able to bring many of you back, our witnesses, for another hearing soon. And again, thank you to all of you for joining us today.
Thank you, Senator Murray. I've got a clarification question and a couple of quick comments, and then we'll thank the witnesses and wind up a hearing. My clarification is I want to make sure I didn't create some confusion by the way I asked the question about going back to school. I asked Dr. Fauci first about treatments and vaccines and Admiral Gioir second about testing. What I thought I heard was that Dr. Fauci said that vaccines are coming as fast as they ever have, but it'll be later in the year at the earliest before we see that there's some treatments that are modest, but are promising. There could be more, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't go back to school. That would be more for a testing strategy. Am I right, Dr. Fauci? You didn't say you shouldn't go back to school because we won't have vaccines by the fall.
No, absolutely not, Mr. Chairman. What I was referring to is that going back to school would be more in the realm of knowing the landscape of infection with regard to testing. And as Admiral Gioir said, it would depend on the dynamics of the outbreak in the region where the school is. But I did not mean to imply at all any relationship between the availability of a vaccine and treatment and our ability to go back to school. You're quite correct.
Thank you. And what I heard from Admiral Gioir was that you're ramping up current technologies. You are hopeful for Dr. Collins' Shark Tank and the National Institutes of Health, but in any event, you would expect to have the capacity in the fall of 40 to 50 million tests a month. And that ought to be adequate for the principal of a middle school or even the chancellor of a campus to design a testing strategy that could provide, for example, an antigen quick test to screen all the students in the school if necessary. Is that correct?
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman. And again, we want to make as many tests available as absolutely possible. What I said is what I feel comfortable with, knowing the production schedules, being in the position of being able to work with the FDA and CDC, that we should have 40 to 50. We will have 40 to 50 million tests available per month that need to be deployed in a smart, strategic way, depending on the dynamics, in that area and in that region. Still, having testing even widely does not nullify the need that we're going to have to change our practices in terms of sanitation, personal cleanliness, distancing, face masks, things like that, given what the dynamics could be.
Well, thank you for those comments, because given that number of tests that will be available in, say, 3 months, or as we ramp up to that number 3 months from now, that should give every principal, every chancellor of every college campus, and again, we have about 5,000 campuses and 100,000 schools, some reassurance that testing, as well as the common sense hygiene practices you talked about, could be used to develop a strategy for reopening school in August. And then 2 quick comments. One is Senator Murray talked about the national plan, which was in the legislation that we all voted for. There's a little bit of a push and tug between what's national and what's federal, what Washington should do and what the states should do. I've always thought it's a mistake to say federal equals national. In other words, COVID-19 is clearly a national problem, but that doesn't mean the federal government's supposed to do everything. For example, in testing, the law actually requires states to tell you, Admiral Gioir, what their plans are, what their needs are. And then you said that during the month of May, you had a series of state plans that identified 12.5 million tests, and you thought you could help meet that. On the other hand, you've also noticed a deficiency in the marketplace for some supplies, so the federal government is buying those and allocating them to the states. So we don't want to get in a situation where Admiral Gioir is telling all the states what to do. Governor Lee in Tennessee doesn't really want you to tell him what to do. He wants to tell you what he's doing and let you comment on it. I don't think Governor Cuomo wants President Trump telling him what to do. So the push and tug between what Washington does and what the states do, I think we have a testing, contact tracing, isolating national strategy and plan led by the governors, designed by the federal government as a national effort. And then the national effort clearly is to do the research for the treatments and the vaccines. And what we've heard today is that's coming along on a faster track than we've ever seen before. Finally, I want to reiterate, I thought this was a very helpful hearing. I thank the senators for their questions. I think anybody who took the time to watch would be impressed by the diversity of opinion and the honest answers we got from 4 really remarkable experts who are in the midst of this every day. I want to reemphasize what I said earlier, that I intend to make sure that we focus. Senator Murray suggested we need to have more hearings. I agree with her. And as we deal with this pandemic, we need to make sure we're ready for the next one. What can we learn about faster treatments and vaccines for the next one? What can we learn about the stockpile, what ought to be in it, who ought to be manage it for the next one? What can we learn? Can we learn anything about having hospital beds so we don't have to shut down hospitals and bankrupt them and push patients out in order to create beds for sick people from the pandemic? What about states and hospitals that sell off their PPE in between pandemics? How do we keep our focus in between pandemics when we have so many important things to be worried about in this country? How do we make sure that we in Congress sustain and fund all the things that we need to do? So, and I want to make sure that we do that this year. I mean, our collective memory is short. So while we're all worried about this, we need to not only deal with this crisis, but get ready for the next one. I thank the witnesses for their extra time. I hope they get a sense that our job, we see, is to create an environment in which you can succeed, because if you succeed, our country succeeds, which is what we desperately want. The hearing record will remain open for 10 days. Members may submit additional information for the record within that time if they would like. Thanks to everyone for being here today. The hearing is adjourned.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Senator Murray. Appreciate it.